The last harvest wagon rolled into the village in late October, piled with grain, root vegetables, and whatever else the fields yielded. After that, nothing. The ground froze solid, snow buried the roads. Fresh food disappeared until spring, sometimes 6 months away. For medieval families, winter wasn't just cold. It was a test of whether you had stored enough, planned carefully enough, and rationed strictly enough to survive. One miscalculation, one failed harvest, one longer than expected winter meant starvation. So how did ordinary people make food last for half a year? What methods kept grain from rotting, meat from spoiling, and families from dying when the stores ran empty? Before we uncover the preservation techniques and brutal rationing strategies, if you're fascinated by how medieval people survived months without fresh food, hit the subscribe button and give a like. The cycle began in autumn. Everything about medieval life oriented toward this moment. Farmers harvested wheat, barley, rye, and oats, threshing the grain and storing it in wooden chests or clay vessels. Every kernel mattered. A family of 5 needed roughly 20 bushels of grain to survive winter, enough for daily bread, porridge, and ale. Anything less meant hunger. Root vegetables, turnips, parsnips, carrots, onions were pulled from the ground and stored in cellars or pits dug beneath the house. These vegetables lasted months if kept cool and dry, though they shriveled and lost flavor over time. Apples and pears were picked and laid in straw. Cabbages were cut and buried in sand. Beans and peas, dried on the vine, were shelled and bagged. Every available space, rafters, corners, under beds, filled with food. The house became a storehouse because there was no other option. No market would sell fresh produce in January. No merchant would travel snow-blocked roads to deliver supplies. What you stored in autumn was what you ate until spring. And if you stored poorly, if rats got into the grain or mold crept into the vegetables, your family starved while watching your neighbors eat. Here's where survival becomes strategy. Preservation wasn't one technique, but a combination of methods, each suited to different foods. Grain, the staple of medieval diet, required protection from moisture and pests. Families stored it in sealed wooden chests, lined with straw, or in large ceramic jars covered with cloth and wax. Some villages built communal granaries, stone buildings with raised floors to prevent rats from entering. But even in the best conditions, grain faced threats. Weevils burrowed into kernels, mold spread if any moisture entered, mice chewed through containers. Families checked their stores weekly, removing damaged grain before it contaminated the rest. For vegetables, cellars provided cool, dark environments that slowed decay. A well-built cellar, dug deep enough to avoid freezing but not so deep that dampness ruined everything, could keep root vegetables edible for months. Turnips lasted longest. Carrots began to soften by midwinter. Onions sprouted in late winter, their green shoots still edible but signaling the end of storage. Families ate the most perishable items first, saving the hardiest vegetables for late winter when nothing else remained. This required discipline. A child begging for an apple in November had to be refused because that apple might be the difference between survival and starvation in March. Meat required different approaches because flesh spoiled rapidly, even in cold weather. The autumn slaughter was a critical event. Families couldn't afford to feed livestock through winter when fodder was scarce and expensive. Instead, they slaughtered most animals in late autumn, keeping only breeding stock and essential work animals. Pigs were killed first because they fattened quickly and their meat preserved well. Cattle, sheep, and goats followed. The slaughter produced more meat than a family could eat fresh, so preservation began immediately. Salting was the primary method. Butchered meat was rubbed with coarse salt, which drew out moisture and created an environment hostile to bacteria. The salt had to be pure and plentiful, and for poor families this was a problem. Salt was expensive, sometimes taxed heavily by lords or kings. A family might spend a significant portion of their income on enough salt to preserve winter meat. The salted meat was packed in barrels, layered with more salt between each piece, then sealed. This meat, called salt pork or salt beef, lasted months but became incredibly tough and salty. Before cooking, it had to be soaked in water to remove excess salt, then boiled for hours to soften. The taste was harsh, nothing like fresh meat, but it provided protein and fat that kept people alive. Now the ingenious part emerges. Smoking offered another preservation method, one that added flavor while extending shelf life. After slaughter, meat was hung in smokehouses, small wooden structures with a fire pit beneath and racks above. The fire burned slowly, producing thick smoke that enveloped the meat for days or weeks. Oak, beech, and applewood were preferred for their flavors. The smoke dried the meat's surface, deposited antimicrobial compounds, and created a barrier against flies and rot. Smoked hams, bacon, and sausages became staples of winter diets across Europe. The process required constant attention. The fire couldn't go out or burn too hot. The meat had to be rotated to ensure even smoking. Families took turns tending the smokehouse, especially at night when temperatures dropped and fires needed feeding. Smoked meat wasn't perfect. It was dry, chewy, and required soaking or long cooking to become palatable. But it lasted. A properly smoked ham could hang in a cool cellar until spring, providing small portions of meat throughout the lean months. And unlike salted meat, which required expensive salt, smoking only needed wood, labor, and time, resources even poor families possessed. Fish presented its own challenges and solutions. Coastal and riverside communities relied heavily on fish, especially during Lent and other fasting periods when meat was forbidden. Fresh fish spoiled within hours, so preservation was essential. Salting worked for fish just as it did for meat. Herring, cod, and other species were gutted, packed in salt and stored in barrels. Salt cod became a major trade item, shipped across Europe and providing protein to inland communities. Smoking fish was equally common. Kippers, smoked herring, and other preserved fish hung in smokehouses alongside meat. Drying was another method. Fish were split open, laid on racks in the sun and wind, and left until completely desiccated. Dried fish, hard as wood, could last years if kept dry. Before eating, it was soaked in water overnight, then boiled or stewed. The texture remained tough and the flavor fishy, but dried fish offered portable, long-lasting protein for travelers, soldiers, and families whose other stores ran low. Fishing through winter was possible in some regions. Ice fishing, cutting holes through frozen rivers and lakes, provided occasional fresh fish, though the catch was unpredictable and the work dangerous. More often, families relied on what they'd preserved in autumn, eating small portions of salted or smoked fish to make supplies last. Don't miss this critical detail. Dairy products required careful management because milk spoiled quickly, even in cold weather. Families couldn't simply store fresh milk for months. Instead, they transformed milk into products that lasted. Cheese was the most important. After autumn calving, when cows produced more milk than the household needed, the excess was made into cheese. Hard cheeses, aged for months, developed thick rinds that protected the interior from mold and pests. These wheels of cheese, stored in cool cellars, provided fat and protein throughout winter. Butter was salted and packed in wooden firkins, small barrels that kept it from turning rancid. Salted butter tasted strong, almost sour, but it was edible and valuable. Some families buried butter in peat bogs, where the cold, acidic environment preserved it for years. Bog butter, as it's now called, has been found by archaeologists, still intact after centuries. For daily use, families made small amounts of fresh cheese and butter when possible, but most dairy products came from autumn surplus, carefully preserved to last until cows began producing milk again in spring. Rationing was the invisible discipline that made preservation work. A family might have enough food to survive winter, but only if they ate carefully, measuring portions, resisting temptation, and accepting hunger as normal. Daily rations were small by modern standards. Bread, the foundation of every meal, was distributed in set amounts. Adults received a loaf or two per day, children half that. The bread wasn't soft and white, it was dense, dark, made from rye or barley mixed with peas or even ground acorns when grain ran short. Porridge, boiled grain with water and whatever vegetables remained, filled stomachs without consuming too much stored food. Meat and fish appeared sparingly, perhaps once or twice a week, and then only in small portions added to soups or stews to stretch their value. The goal wasn't satisfaction, but survival. Families felt hungry most of the time, especially as winter stretched on and stores dwindled. Children cried for more food. Adults went to bed with empty stomachs. But giving in, eating extra now, meant nothing left later. Rationing required constant vigilance and often fell to women, who managed household stores, measured portions, and endured accusations when family members complained. The social pressure was immense. A woman who miscalculated and ran out of food early faced blame for her family's starvation. Yet the tools she had, rough measurements, unpredictable weather, uncertain harvest yields, made perfect planning impossible. Class differences shaped winter survival profoundly. Nobles and wealthy merchants stored far more food than they needed, filling entire rooms with grain, barrels of salted meat, wheels of cheese, jars of preserved fruit, and casks of wine. Their cellars were stocked not just for survival, but for feasting. Even in January, a noble's table held multiple courses, roasted meats, spiced dishes, imported delicacies. They didn't ration, they indulged, sometimes ostentatiously, hosting banquets while peasants outside their walls starved. This disparity was visible and resented. Poor families scraped by on bread and porridge while watching smoke rise from manor house chimneys, smelling roasted meat they'd never taste. Yet wealth didn't guarantee safety. Bad harvests affected everyone. A noble whose estates produced poor yields faced food shortages just like peasants, though they could afford to buy grain from other regions if roads remained passable. For peasants, there was no backup plan. Their stores were everything. When those stores ran out, they faced stark choices: beg, steal, eat things not meant for food, or starve. Here's the twist that changes everything. When winter lasted too long, or stores ran out early, people ate whatever they could find. Bark stripped from trees and boiled until soft. Acorns, bitter and toxic unless properly prepared. Ground into flour. Grass, weeds and roots dug from frozen ground. These famine foods kept people alive but barely. They provided little nutrition and often caused illness. Eating too much bark led to intestinal blockages. Improperly prepared acorns poisoned people with tannins. Desperation drove families to slaughter their breeding animals. The cow meant to produce next year's calf. The chickens that would lay spring eggs. This solved immediate hunger but destroyed future food security. A family that ate its plow ox couldn't farm the next season. They faced another year of starvation, and another, until they abandoned their land or died. Chroniclers recorded winters when entire villages were found empty, inhabitants dead in their homes, bodies too weak to bury. These weren't rare tragedies. They were recurring events across medieval Europe, reminders that survival was never guaranteed. The Church's role during winter fasts added complexity. Lent, the 40 days before Easter, overlapped with late winter when stores were lowest. During Lent, meat was forbidden except for the sick and very young. Families already struggling to stretch food supplies now faced additional restrictions. They couldn't eat the salted pork or smoked bacon stored for emergencies. Instead, they relied on fish, which was scarce and expensive, or doubled down on bread and porridge. For wealthy households, this was inconvenient. For poor families, it was potentially deadly. Some priests granted dispensations, allowing meat consumption when starvation threatened. Others rigidly enforced fasting rules, preaching that spiritual discipline mattered more than physical comfort. The debate over Lenten fasting during famine years appears in church records, revealing tension between religious authority and human survival. Yet for many families, the rules didn't matter. They had no meat left by Lent anyway. Their stores had run out, and they faced weeks until spring planting with nothing to eat. Community support networks sometimes made the difference between survival and death. Villages shared resources when possible. A family whose grain spoiled might receive small amounts from neighbors. Wealthier peasants sometimes provided loans of food, repaid after the next harvest. Churches distributed alms, bread for the poorest parishioners, though this charity was limited and often came with moral judgment. Monasteries opened their doors during severe famines, feeding hundreds from their stores until supplies ran low, then closing the gates and leaving the rest to starve. These acts of charity were genuine but insufficient. Medieval society lacked the infrastructure for large-scale famine relief. When entire regions faced crop failure, no one had surplus food to share. People died in their homes, in the streets, in the woods where they'd gone searching for anything edible. The survivors remembered these winters, passing down warnings to the next generation, reminding them that careless storage, wasteful consumption, or insufficient preparation meant death. By late winter, even well-prepared families reached their lowest point. The grain barrel was nearly empty. The last turnips were soft and sprouting. Preserved meat was gone, or reduced to tiny portions. People counted days until spring. They watched for signs: birds returning, ice melting on rivers, the first green shoots in the fields. When those signs came, they brought hope, but also a dangerous period. Spring meant food would come eventually, but not yet. Fields had to be plowed, seeds planted, crops grown. Months passed between the first thaw and the first harvest. This gap, sometimes called the hungry gap, killed people who'd survived winter but couldn't last until summer. They'd eaten their seed grain, desperate to survive another week. Now they had nothing to plant, or they were too weak from months of hunger to work the fields. Their bodies, depleted of fat and muscle, couldn't perform the labor needed to grow food. Some villages organized communal planting, healthy members working the fields of sick or starving families. Others watched as households collapsed, their land abandoned, their names disappearing from parish records. The legacy of medieval winter survival lives in our modern food systems. Every grocery store stocked year-round with fresh produce, every freezer preserving food indefinitely, every supply chain delivering meals across continents is a response to the centuries when winter meant hunger. We've conquered the seasonal scarcity that dominated medieval life, but the strategies they used, preservation, rationing, community support, still underpin how humans think about food security. When we buy extra canned goods or freeze leftovers, we're echoing medieval families who knew that survival depended on planning ahead. Their winters were brutal, filled with hunger, cold, and the constant fear of starvation, yet they endured, developing techniques that kept millions alive through countless winters. Their success wasn't guaranteed or comfortable. It was hard-won through discipline, ingenuity, and the willingness to endure suffering that would break most modern people. And it reminds us that the abundance we take for granted is recent, fragile, and built on the lessons learned by those who survived when survival seemed impossible. If you enjoy the hidden sides of medieval life, hit subscribe and give this video a like.